The day their mother died, the world stopped turning. 10-year-old Ethan stood in the hallway, his hand gripping the doorframe until his knuckles turned white. Beside him, 6-year-old Noah stared at the floorboards, his breathing shallow and erratic. The house settled into a heavy, suffocating silence that seemed to press against their chests. 3 days passed in a blur of gray light and cold meals. Then, the kitchen table held the final blow. A single sheet of paper rested near the sugar bowl. Ethan picked it up. The handwriting was jagged, hurried. "I can't do this anymore." He read the words twice, then a third time, waiting for them to change. They did not. The front door groaned on its hinges, then clicked shut with a finality that echoed through every room. The sound vibrated in the walls, then died away. Ethan looked at the empty hallway, then back at the note. He folded it once, twice, and tucked it into his pocket. The house was no longer a home. It was a tomb of wood and glass, holding 2 boys who were suddenly, entirely alone. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the window panes. Ethan moved to the pantry. He opened the door, staring at the sparse shelves. 3 boxes of crackers, a half-empty jar of peanut butter. He counted them again, his fingers trembling against the cardboard. He divided the crackers into small, precise piles, pushing them to the back of the shelf to hide the emptiness. Every movement felt heavy, deliberate. He turned back to the living room, where the ceiling had begun to weep. A steady drip hit the floorboards, a rhythmic, maddening sound. Ethan grabbed a roll of duct tape from the junk drawer. He climbed onto a kitchen chair, his reach barely touching the plaster. He pressed the tape over the crack, smoothing it down. The tape held for a moment, then peeled away. Noah sat in the corner, clutching a worn-out pillow to his stomach. Ethan climbed down and sat on the floor beside his brother. The roof continued to drip, a slow, relentless countdown. In the corner of the living room, the fireplace had long since gone cold. Max had spent years curled there, a golden furred fixture in a house that once held warmth. But the air had changed. It tasted of stale dust and the sharp, metallic tang of fear. Max lifted his head, ears twitching toward the bedroom door where the boys sat in the dark. He stood, his joints popping, and stretched his spine. He did not look back at the hearth. His claws clicked against the hardwood, a steady, deliberate rhythm. He reached the bedroom threshold and paused, sniffing the air. Ethan was huddled against the wall, his eyes wide and fixed on nothing. Noah was curled into a ball, his breathing shallow. Max moved forward, his tail brushing the floorboards with a soft, rhythmic thud. He circled the bed once, twice, testing the space, before he finally settled at the foot of the mattress. He let out a long, heavy sigh, his warmth radiating into the cold air. Every time Ethan shifted or Noah whimpered, Max's tail thumped against the wood. It was a slow, steady pulse in the dark, a heartbeat that anchored the room. For the first time since the house went silent, the boys stopped shivering. They reached down, fingers burying into the thick, coarse fur, and found a reason to close their eyes. The first sign was the wind. It did not howl. It shrieked, slamming against the house with the force of a physical blow. A shingle tore loose, clattering down the roof like a frantic heartbeat. Then, the lights flickered once, twice, and died. The darkness that followed was absolute, heavy, and freezing. Ethan scrambled to his feet, his hands grasping at the empty air. He reached for the wall, his palms sliding against the cold, damp plaster until he found the bed frame. He pulled Noah closer, but the boy was burning. Noah's skin felt like hot coals against Ethan's palm. His breathing came in short, ragged hitches that rattled in his small chest. Ethan tried to speak, but his own teeth were chattering too violently to form words. He pulled every blanket they owned from the closet, piling them onto the bed, but the cold seeped through the walls, turning the air into a thin, biting mist. The house groaned under the assault, the floorboards vibrating with every gust. He was 10 years old, and he was holding a life that was slipping away into the freezing dark. Noah let out a low, guttural moan, his head lolling against Ethan's chest. His skin was slick with sweat, yet he shivered as if submerged in ice. Ethan pressed his palm to the boy's forehead, feeling the heat radiate like a furnace. He was trapped. The house felt smaller, the walls closing in. He looked toward the hallway, his eyes straining against the gloom. Max was already moving. The dog stood at the bedroom threshold, his silhouette a jagged shadow. He did not look back. He walked toward the front door, his claws clicking rhythmically on the hardwood. He reached the heavy oak slab and stopped. He turned his head, his eyes catching a sliver of moonlight, and let out a low, steady whine. He nudged the brass handle with his wet nose. Ethan hesitated, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He looked at Noah, then at the dog. He stood, his legs trembling. He crossed the room. He gripped the cold metal, turned it, and pushed. The door swung wide, and the storm roared inside. Max did not wait. He bolted, a blur of motion vanishing into the black, rain-lashed night. The door slammed shut behind him. Ethan sat on the floor, his arms locked around Noah, listening to the wind tear at the eaves. Every minute felt like an hour. He whispered stories of their mother, his voice cracking, trying to anchor Noah to the room. Then, a sharp, white beam of light sliced through the darkness of the window, sweeping across the peeling wallpaper. Voices shouted from the porch, muffled by the gale. The front door swung open, and the room flooded with the smell of rain, wet earth, and pine. Max burst inside first, his frame shaking, his coat matted with thick, dark mud and jagged burrs. Two farmers followed, their lanterns swinging, casting long, frantic shadows against the walls. They wore heavy, sodden gear, their faces etched with concern. When they saw the boys huddled on the floor, they dropped their lanterns and rushed forward, their boots thudding heavily on the floorboards. Max, his mission finally complete, let out a long, ragged breath. He collapsed onto the rug, his paws raw, the pads shredded and bleeding. The transition happened in a blur of sterile hallways and quiet rooms. The foster home was a place of soft light and steady heat, a stark contrast to the hollowed-out shell they had left behind. Ethan watched as the social worker placed warm bowls of soup on the table. The steam rose in lazy curls, filling the air with the scent of broth and bread. Noah sat beside him, his hands wrapped tightly around the ceramic mug, his gaze fixed on the floor. He no longer shivered. The fever had broken, leaving him pale but steady. Max was always there. He moved like a shadow, his gait stiff from the miles he had traversed in the dark. He did not roam the new yard or chase the local birds. Instead, he claimed the space between the boys and the hallway. Every night, as the house settled into the quiet rhythm of sleep, Max would lay his heavy head down across the threshold of their bedroom door. He stretched his body out, blocking the entrance completely. When the boys woke in the middle of the night, they would look toward the door and see his silhouette, a dark, unmoving barrier against the world outside. Months of silence ended with a knock on the porchwood. Ethan and Noah looked up from their books as the front door swung open. Their father stood in the frame, his face flushed, his eyes darting around the room. He took a step forward, his hands reaching out, his mouth opening to speak. He began a string of apologies, his voice thin and cracking against the quiet of the house. He moved toward the boys, his weight shifting forward. Then, the floorboards groaned. Max rose from his spot at the door. He did not bark. He did not growl. He simply walked into the center of the porch, his paws planting firmly on the wood. He stood between the man and the children, his body a rigid, unyielding line. He held his head high, his gaze locked onto the man. The father stopped. He looked at the dog, then at the boys, and finally at the space Max had claimed as his own. The man's hands dropped to his sides. He took a slow, heavy step backward until he reached the edge of the porch. He turned without another word and walked toward his car. The sound of the car engine faded until it was nothing more than a hum against the horizon. Then silence returned to the porch. Ethan and Noah stood still, watching the dust settle where the vehicle had been. The man was gone, and with him, the last tether to a past that had left them in the dark. They turned away from the open door and looked down. Max remained exactly where he had planted himself, his chest rising and falling in a steady, rhythmic pulse. He did not look at the road. He looked only at them. Ethan knelt on the wooden planks, his knees pressing into the grain, and Noah followed, sliding down to sit beside him. They reached out, their fingers sinking deep into the thick, coarse fur that had weathered the storm and the cold. They buried their faces against his neck, feeling the warmth radiating from his body, a heat that had nothing to do with fireplaces or heaters. In that moment, the truth settled into the space between them. Family was not a name on a piece of paper or a bloodline that could be severed by a note on a kitchen table. Family was the heartbeat that stayed when the roof tore away. It was the pause that bled on the jagged terrain to bring help. It was the presence that stood as a wall against the world when everything else had fallen apart. They had never been abandoned. They had been found by the only one who mattered. Max let out a long, slow sigh, his tail thumping once against the porch floor. And for the first time in their lives, the boys felt entirely, undeniably safe.